Shall we start, sir?
Yes. Good evening, everyone. I welcome all of you once again in the series of webinars being conducted by our law office. So today we have with us our esteemed speaker, Ms. Tanya Agarwal, advocate, who is going to speak on one very practical topic, that is overview of remand, arrest and bail. So with this, I would also like to welcome my today's moderator for the day, Ms. Ritika Juneja, who is also assistant professor in law, Vivekananda Law School. So I now request Ritika to kindly introduce our today's speaker, Ms. Tanya Agarwal. Over to you, Ritika.
Thank you, sir. A very good evening to all of you. Today, I, Ritika Juneja, Assistant Professor, Vivekananda Institute of Professional Studies, have been granted with the opportunity to be the moderator for today's webinar. Today, we have with us Advocate Tanya Agarwal as a keynote speaker. Ma'am is an independent legal practitioner based out of Delhi and is an alumnus of National Law University, Jodhpur. Over the period of time, she has gained experience in commercial disputes, labor laws, home buyer disputes, real estate laws, commercial contracts, infrastructure laws, intellectual property laws, arbitration laws, company and insolvency laws. Apart from civil and commercial matters, she also deals with criminal matters, economic offenses, and matrimonial disputes. She appears regularly before the Supreme Court of India, Delhi High Court, NCDRC, NCLAT, NCLT, DRAT, NGT, and railway tribunals, and also the district courts in Delhi. She has drafted and argued SLPs, civil appeals, transfer petitions, and writ petitions. We welcome you, ma'am, for the today's webinar, and we look forward for a highly informative and intellectual session. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Nitesh, for inviting me. And thank you so much, Ritika, for introducing me. So now I'll start with the session. The reason why we picked up this topic is that these days, the importance of arrest, remand, and bail has become very, very important. You know, these are the matters probably which are being more taken up by the courts probably because of coronavirus. And the very reason for taking up this topic is that it deals with the personal liberty of an individual. What happens when you're picked up from your house? What happens when you are taken to a place which is not your home or your place of work or any other place which is familiar to you? When your movement is restricted, when you're put in a completely different location. So therefore, that is why what is the importance when these things happen? What is one has to do? So then comes into play these concepts of arrest, remand, and bail. These are three things which impinge on personal liberty of an individual. And it is something which is very, very important, and it is protected by the Constitution itself. So if you look at how the Constitution functions, which is the mother of all the laws in our country, if you look at Article 21, it says no person shall be deprived of his personal liberty and life except according to the procedure established by law. So that is where you find the concept of personal liberty. It's ingrained in the Constitution itself. Two most important articles I would like you to see is Article 21 of the Constitution and Article 22 of the Constitution, where a magistrate finds mention in the Constitution. If you look at Article 22, it says a person who is detained in custody, who is detained by a police officer, has to be produced before the magistrate within 24 hours of such arrest. So a very, very, judge sitting in the smallest court in the country finds place in the Constitution and in the very beginning of the article of the Constitution, the fundamental rights of the Constitution. So that is what is the importance is of a magistrate who's exercising the right of remanding somebody to judicial custody or exercising the right to remanding somebody to police custody. Now let us see what was the position when the Constitution was enacted. 1950, a constitution was enacted, and A.K. Gopalan was a man. He was an activist, and he was kept under preventive detention. Now, there's another thing which Article 22 also deals with preventive detention. So this man is picked up, he's put in jail, he goes to Supreme Court under Article 32 and he says, look, my Article 19(1)(a), that is right to freedom of speech and expression, my Article 19(1)(d), that is my freedom to move freely throughout the territory of the country is curtailed, and I should be allowed to be released. Article 21, Article 22, all this comes into play. A very narrow and pedantic approach is taken by Supreme Court during that time, which goes on for 25 years, and they say personal liberty has to be seen in terms of the enacted law. Meaning, if a law says that no hearing, you're not entitled for a hearing when you're picked up and put in the police custody, no hearing, then that law itself will allow you to go behind the bars. This Gopalan's ghost was put to rest finally by Supreme Court in Maneka Gandhi's case after 25 years. They said, no, the enacted law has to be reasonable. The enacted law has to be fair. The enacted law has to be just. That meaning thereby that you cannot detain somebody before 24 hours. If the magistrate is applying his mind whether to send that person to remand to judicial custody or police custody, they have to apply their mind, and they have to apply their mind in a judicious manner. These are the principles which have evolved slowly and gradually over a period of time. Now I'll direct you to how this concept of arrest has been translated into our statutory mandate under CRPC. If you look at CRPC sections 40 onwards, 41 onwards rather, it deals with arrest of persons. What happens when somebody is arrested? Does the police have the power to arrest? When should the police exercise this power to arrest? So you should look at very carefully at section 41. Now I'll give you a brief background as to what happened. See, if you look at the position prior to 2009, there is an amendment in CRPC. Prior to 2009, the police used to act in a different fashion. The powers which were granted to the police under the act, they were moduled differently. They were not straight-jacket, you know, they could just exercise their power whenever want. There were no checks and balances. But in 2009, an amendment was made putting checks and balances on the police, that you see whether it's a reasonable information which is given to you, whether it's a credible information which is given to you. You look at the antecedents of the person. You look at whether there is any justification to exercise such power. So what happened was that for offenses which are below punishable by imprisonment below 7 years, they very clearly said that you can decide to, you know, give a notice to them. Probably under section 41A, you can give a notice to appear rather than directly arresting the person. You can give a notice to appear. If that person complies with the notice to appear and continues to comply with that notice to appear, in that circumstance, there is no need to arrest, provided you have to obviously see certain factors. You have to keep certain factors in mind. For example, that you can secure the attendance of that person at the time of the trial, what are his previous antecedents, whether the accusations are grave, and other factors, whether he'll threaten the witness, whether he'll tamper with the evidence. So these factors have to be seen at that time. But if it is below 7 years, and if these factors are not to be worried about the police person, then there is no need to arrest. And the police shall record, if in case, even in such circumstances, they are arresting somebody, then they have to specifically say, what is the reason of the arrest? They have to provide the reason for the arrest. Now, all these amendments were made pursuant to a very elaborate judgment written by Justice Anand, which I would recommend everybody to read. This is D.K. Basu versus State of West Bengal, and the citation is 1997, 1 SEC 416. Now here Justice Anand very clearly laid down an 11-point guideline as to what should be done at the time of the arrest. And it is very important, you know, to see as to how arrest should be effected. He very clearly said, you know, at the time the person has to be arrested, the person arresting the accused, the police official arresting the accused should wear a very clear and visible and identification badge, meaning thereby the person who is placing the accused, the official who is placing the accused under arrest should be identifiable as to he will be answerable. Where did the person go? You had put him under arrest. That's how accountability, to create accountability. And this was later on also incorporated in CRPC, that the person who, or the police official who has to arrest will bear a very clear identification. That is first and foremost. Second, the police official who is arresting will prepare an arrest memo. That arrest memo will disclose what is the date of arrest, what is the time of arrest, what is the place of arrest, And that arrest memo will have the signatures of the person who will be informed on behalf of the accused that so and so accused, which is your relative, has been arrested on so and so date, so and so time, so and so place, and there is a signature of the accused on that, meaning thereby inform somebody from the home, inform somebody if somebody is not available from home, inform somebody in the locality as to, you know, this has happened. And on top of that, you also ensure that some of the relative or some of the family member of the accused person is informed about the arrest, and this thing has also to be countersigned by the accused himself. So these are checks and balances with time which have been incorporated into CRPC, which were not there prior to 2009. So what we look at in CRPC now, it never existed for so many years, from 1950, 1973 when the CRPC was enacted, and when our India became independent and constitution came into force 1950. From that time, there were no such provisions, no preparation of arrest memo, no identification as to who's the police official, nothing was followed. All these things were absent. They were all incorporated later, very recently, 10 years ago. Now, one more important thing which Supreme Court in DK Basu's case I would like to highlight is, they also said that power to arrest is one thing and justification to exercise such power is another thing. The police might have power. If there is a commission of a cognizable offense, the police has power to arrest somebody, but whether it is justified to arrest or not to arrest, this principle was emphasized in one of the most famous cases by Supreme Court in Joginder Kumar versus State of UP. There was a young lawyer, 28-year-old lawyer. He was called by the police in Ghaziabad police station, and he was accompanied by his brother. So his brother was informed that today he's here and we'll ask him to return home by tomorrow evening. And so the brother left. The brother waited. His brother had not returned. He came back to the police station in Ghaziabad. He was informed your brother has been sent to Mussoorie for some work and he'll return. He went to Mussoorie and visited the local police station. He was informed that your brother has been sent to an unidentified location. Now what he did was, the brother of the missing person, he filed a habeas corpus, and when this matter came before Supreme Court, that person, the lawyer, was released and he was produced before the court. That is what generally happens in habeas corpus cases. But the larger question which loomed before the court at that point of time was, arrest is one thing, but justification to exercise. What was the need? What was the material before the police to just arrest somebody like that? Is there a reasonable complaint? Is there a credible information? Is there something on record? Is there some material before the police to satisfy itself that I should arrest that person? Because arrest ceases a person to be free anymore. It takes out an individual from the setting which he is already existing and put in a different situation altogether. It's not only a physical restraint, but it is also it also creates an impact on the mental health of a person who is being arrested. So the court in this case very clearly said that while exercising this power of arrest, you should have some justification. And it also took note of National Police Commission report, where it said that 60% of the arrests in this country are done unnecessarily, completely unnecessarily. Recently, if you would have read in the newspapers and in the other articles available online, you could have seen Tuticorin case, how a man was picked up by the police just because he violated the lockdown guidelines. He opened his shop after 9 p.m. and all that was done was he was picked up, and then we all know what happened. And what happened when the magistrate remanded the accused despite knowing that there were injuries on his body. So this is the kind of practice which is going on. Now I will not deviate and I'll come back to the topic. So you should look at section 41 onwards, that lays down what happens and under what circumstances can the police exercise its power to arrest somebody. And it is very clear, if it is a non-cognizable offense, the police can exercise its power, no worries. The only thing that has to be kept in mind, that 7 years and above, that should be punishable by 7 years and above. If it is below 7 years, it's preferable that you do not arrest the person until unless other circumstances are justified that he's not going to tamper the evidence, he's not required for proper investigation and all those elements are fulfilled. There is no need to arrest that person. You can serve the notice for appearance. Now, what happens when that person is arrested? Now, before that, we'll look at how an arrest is made. What do you mean by arrest? When would you say that a person is placed under arrest? Is it merely by word? If I say if I'm the police official and if I tell person A, you are under arrest, does it mean that person is under arrest? How does it work? Or do I physically detain that person, or I physically confine him, or I physically touch his body? It is only at that point of time that person is considered to be arrested. In this regard, you should look at section 46 of CRPC. It says that general presumption is that that merely by action, let's say there's a police official and I am here and there's a gun in my hand and he's there. He says you are placed under arrest. So the mere fact that I start to keep my gun down on the floor can be interpreted as I have submitted to the custody, provided the fact that I try to run away after that, which obviously I would not if I'm keeping my gun down on the floor. So, but in cases of women, it is generally assumed that an oral intimation of arrest is enough to place the woman under custody, meaning thereby that if you orally intimate to a woman that you are placed under arrest, that intimation in itself means that that woman has been placed under custody, unless it is shown that she tries to escape or there are any other circumstances of resistance. And how much restraint has to be exercised? Does it mean that all the police officials will go grab and handcuff that person? No, only necessary restraint. You cannot handcuff somebody, only necessary restraint so that the person does not flee from the custody of the police. Only necessary restraint has to be exercised in such circumstances. Now, one thing I would like to highlight on this issue is what happens if somebody else, what happens if the person who has to be arrested is in the house of somebody else? Then then those people have to be intimated. If in case it's a woman who does not come out in the public, then the police has to accordingly inform and make sure that that woman is taken to a different place and then the arrest is effective. So these are certainly, and the police officials can go into other jurisdictions to make an arrest. There is no bar, they can go to other jurisdictions to make an arrest. Now, what happens on arrest being made? Let's say now arrest is made. What will the policeman do? First thing, as I told you, they will prepare an arrest memo, which will have all the identifications and the details. They will inform the nearest relative, and they will also inform that they have a right to be, the police official will also inform the accused that you have a right to consult a legal practitioner of your choice. And this right of consultation is also provided in the Constitution itself, that the accused has a right to consult a lawyer. And it has also been incorporated now in CRPC under section 41D, where it says that not during the entire interrogation, but in between, that person can consult its lawyer. So the person has the right to be consulted, right to consult a legal practitioner of his choice, and also to be defended, which is at a later stage when the trial begins. Now what happens, let's say a person has been arrested by the police. So if there are any articles on that person, if there is some recovery which is effected from that person, then a proper recovery memo will have to be prepared, which has to be signed by independent witnesses in order to later prove that recovery. So, and that if it's a woman, then obviously the search has to be conducted by a women police officer. Now, there is a very interesting turn earlier before 2009. And this is very important. Why? Because custodial torture cases seem to have increased in very recent times. You would have seen this Tuticorin case. Apart from this, this phenomena has sort of become regular, especially in our country where there is no law on, prevention of torture. There is a bill which was proposed, but that was never translated into law. So in these circumstances, this is very important. So what happens is when a person is arrested, then that person should be mandatorily examined by a medical practitioner. This is now made mandatory under section 54 of CRPC. We should look at these sections 52, 53 and 54, 53 and 54 of CRPC. It deals with medical examination of the arrested person. The arrested person has to be immediately examined. Now, one very interesting thing is that a person who is arrested, the police can enjoy the custody of that person only for 24 hours. See, only for 24 hours, not more than that. See, you have to understand one thing. A man is at liberty. He is enjoying his life. Suddenly police comes. And what does the police do? He takes away the person. So the first check is at the point of time when the police is taking away that person. That is the first check that has to be exercised. Therefore, I said, power to arrest something, justification to exercise that power is another thing. There should be some reasonable, credible information before the police. It should not be totally on the whims and fancies of the police that you take somebody under arrest. No, that cannot be done. So the first check is that there should be a justification to exercise such power. That is the first check which is placed. First, before that 24-hour period begins. Now, within those 24 hours, the police will try to complete the investigation. That is what is mandated under, if you look at section 56, 57, 167 of CRPC, you will get all these things. And within that 24 hours, if you fail to do so as a police official, you are mandated not only under constitution, but also a statutory obligation that that person has to be produced before the magistrate. You have to produce the person before the magistrate. And if they fail to do so, then we all know what the consequences are. They are not only liable for departmental action, because if you look at DK Basu, which I recommended you to read, it very clearly says that if in case all these arrest guidelines are not followed by police officials in a timely fashion, they are answerable in a departmental inquiry. Now, coming back to what is the procedure when this 24-hour thing takes place. Now, within 24 hours, you have to place that person before the magistrate. Now, when you say 24 hours, the statute provides that the time taken from the place of arrest to the place where the person has to be produced before the magistrate has to be excluded from 24 hours. And now comes the role of the magistrate. Now comes the role where magistrate has to exercise his judicial discretion on a person's personal liberty. So till now, first it was the police at the time of arresting that person, whether there is a justification. If there is a justification, take away personal liberty. 24 hours, if you cannot complete the investigation, then you produce before the magistrate, and now it's completely in the hands of the magistrate to see whether such person should be sent to police custody or judicial custody. Now, 167(2) CRPC is very, very important because that is the whole source of where a magistrate can remand a person either to police custody or judicial custody. Now, police custody cannot be exceeded for more than 15 days. That is what the statute mandates. In any circumstances, it cannot exceed more than 15 days. And very, very important thing is that prior to granting remand, the magistrate is just not like a post office. It's not that, police official will come, he'll bring an application, he'll give to the magistrate and say that, I want remand. And therefore the magistrate will say, okay, straight away 15 days remand because I have the power to do so. No, this is not how it functions. And it should not function like that. He's not a post office. He's not a rubber stamp. He is the most crucial element where a check and a balance can be created on a personal liberty and abuse of power of police. It's the most important checkpoint which has been placed. We understand the police has done something, but within 24 hours, it's at that 24th hour, when the man is standing in the magistrate's court, because there's a reason why am I saying a man is standing in the magistrate's court, because 167, if you read very carefully, subclause 2, clause 2, subclause B says that the person has to be physically produced before the magistrate. For the first remand, for the first time after 24 hours, you have to produce that person. The police official will have to produce the accused physically, and physically presence is important. Why? The magistrate can always ask him questions. Magistrate can always see whether there are any injuries on his body. That is the importance. And on basis of that, the magistrate can decide whether he should grant police custody or he should not grant police custody. This is very, very important. This is a judicial function. This is not some executive function performed by the magistrate. It's a judicial function, and he should exercise his judicial mind at the time of performing such at the time of remanding a person to custody. Now, one thing which is very important is you should also, since you're all practicing in Delhi High Court, you should look at the Delhi High Court criminal rules. It deals elaboratively as to how the magistrate should exercise its power, what documents should he see, what should he not do. I'll quickly, and briefly take you through this. Before that, I'll just point out 167 requires that the police official who is producing the accused before a magistrate also submits the case diary. It's very important because case diary is like a daily entry diary by that police official. At this time he did this, at this time he did this. And this shows, that It should be able to, that that case diary will help the magistrate to decide whether there is a reason for remand or not. If there is an FIR, that FIR copy should be placed before the magistrate. If there's an FIR, he can look at the contents of the FIR and see whether a remand is required or not. Maybe that person is not named in the FIR. Maybe there are no allegations against that person in the FIR. So is there a reason to remand that person to custody? No, there is no reason. He can even discharge. If the magistrate has the power to try that case, he can discharge that person at that stage itself. That is what the law says. Now, I'll quickly and briefly take you through the Delhi High Court practice rules for trial in criminal cases. You should look at chapter 11. It deals with two parts, investigation and remand to police custody. Since we are not dealing with investigation, I'll just stick to remand in police custody. Now, it says first golden rule is never remand a person for 15 days. Keep the remands as short as possible. The total time period is 15 days, but you can keep remands for 2 days, 3 days. So after 2 days, again, the accused is produced. And then they can see, okay, fine, there is still something more that is required. Because what is the purpose of taking a person and putting him in police custody? What is the reason? Is the reason that he has committed a grave offense? No. For that, you can put a person in judicial custody. There is no reason. No, you need that person probably to point out a place where the offense has been committed. You need the person for investigation, for recovery of some material which can be used for discovery under section 27 of the Evidence Act. So that is the purpose. So they have to show some concrete purpose as to why that person is required in police custody. So if you see in cases for surrender, for example, generally judicial custody is not granted because if, in cases of confession, where a person has confessed before the magistrate, there remains nothing that has to be done in an investigation by the police. And therefore, the rule is that do not grant remand in police custody. There is no need to grant remand in police custody. There is nothing for the police left to do. So now, coming back to the guidelines, remand should be as short as possible, 2 days, 3 days. And it should be a speaking order. It should not be an application is filed by the police and seeking remand for so many days. And I deem this is a case of remand and therefore remanded. No, they should give some reasons, applied its mind, satisfied itself. Something should be reflected from the order of remand. It should be a speaking order. It should state that he's involved in a grievous offense or a grave offense, or this is the thing, you know, this is what is it, something, some material to show that the magistrate has applied its mind. Now, the second element, it says, I have already dealt with this, confession before magistrate, then only a judicial custody can be granted. Now, he should record reasons, as I said. Now, when the person is produced before magistrate, what has to be done? What is the role of the magistrate? I'm the magistrate, I'm sitting on the chair. Generally what happens, I'll tell you in the courts, it's done at the end of the day, the magistrate is already tired and those regular applications come for remand. 302 ka ye remand, 304 this remand. So it's done like that. And in the routine fashion, the court does not even bother to see who's the accused. He's present in the, he's present or not present physically. It's all, God knows what happens. And the remand is granted. That's how it is done. They look at the section 302 done, 304 done. So they'll merely look at the section and throw the files. Heinous offenses. No, that is not what is the role of the magistrate. The role of the magistrate is to call that person. He has to be produced physically, to examine him, to tell him what his right is. In fact, the magistrate has to tell him, see, I am the magistrate and you are being produced before me. And this is the stage of remand. And you have a right to be heard by, you have a right to, be heard through a counsel before me. And if in case the person chooses that he wants to be or she wants to be heard by a counsel, provide him an adequate opportunity for hearing. And in that meantime, he can also grant for interim remand, let's say for 1 day in such circumstances, if required, so that the lawyer is adequately prepared to represent the case. So these things have to be seen by the magistrate. He is the check post. 24 hours, he is the check post. Within 24 hours, something happens, police, we can catch hold of them. Definitely till the end they are liable, but magistrate's role is very, very crucial and very, very important. Now there are some judgments which I would like to share with you on this topic. Prior to that, I'll just tell you about this very interesting case. This was a case decided by Justice Y.V. Chandrachud way back in 1980s. It is famously known as, I'll give you the citation of that judgment. It's Ram Sagar something, state of UP versus Ram Sagar. There was this man and he had a field. And what happened was, and he had some cattle, and his neighbor also had fields just adjacent to his plot. And some of the cattle of this man who's dead, who's the deceased, trespassed into the land of his neighbor. So the neighbor filed a complaint for trespass, and the police officials of the local police station, they told this man, who's the deceased in this case, that give us payment of so and so amount, give us 100 rupees, and we'll hush up the case, we'll hush up the complaint. So this man pays 100 rupees. Now next day they come again, they say you now pay 200, we'll hush up the complaint. Now he's like, I don't have 200 rupees. 1970s, 200 rupees is a big amount in those days for a man who's merely an agriculturalist. So now what he does was, somehow, which is very surprising, he manages to lodge a complaint. Now what happens to that complaint? The case does not reflect much upon that. He lodges a complaint saying that he's been asked for continuous bribes and this is what has been happened with him. Within 6 hours of that complaint, this deceased man is picked up by the police. He's picked up by the police and he's now taken somewhere. And sometime in the evening, he's produced before the magistrate. Though it's a case where, the magistrate actually, when he's sitting on his chair and he's doing his regular matters, he's been told by the police official that so-and-so person is being, we are asking for remand for so-and-so person, and kindly grant us the remand. So the magistrate happens to ask, maybe the luck of the deceased, happens to ask that where is the deceased? And the police official informs he's in the veranda outside and he's in a very injured condition and he cannot walk. So the magistrate gets up from his chair. Look at the role of the magistrate and how, if he would have not done this, then these police officials would have not been convicted in this case. So he gets up from his chair. It's 5 o'clock in the evening. All the matters are, he's all piled up with matters. He's been working throughout the day. He gets up from his chair, goes to the veranda and he asks him, what happened to you? How did you sustain these injuries? Who's done it? And the accused, who's almost in a very, very bad condition, he points out to the police officials there and he says that so-and-so person has done so-and-so. Now now the deceased is immediately sent to the, for medical examination, but he happens to die after that. Now, this matter reaches Supreme Court, trial court, High Court, then this matter reaches to Supreme Court. And Justice Chandrachud very beautifully writes in this judgment, that and he acknowledges and he appreciates what should be the role of the magistrate in such cases. He says that if that piece of, in that remand application itself, the magistrate had written, so and so person is produced before me, so and so thing happened, and he detailed it out and with identification of the police officials. So he says that this is a piece of dying declaration, that it is treated as piece of dying declaration to convict the police officials. So that day, if the magistrate had not gotten up his chair to actually go and see what has happened to the accused, it would have all gone hushed up just for what? 200, 300 rupees. So this is what happens. This is the role of the magistrate. I'll give you a contrary example to this. There's this another case. I'll give you citation of this case also. There's a magistrate. Now you look at the role, how one magistrate can actually lead to conviction of a police official who has committed torture in custody, and how another magistrate in a similar circumstances could not do it, and therefore the police officials are happy to go back home. Now what happened in this other case was that the police officials informed the magistrate that the accused is not well and he is sitting in the car, he's sitting in the van, so kindly examine him. Now what the magistrate in this case did was, it was dim light at that point of time, probably dark at that point of time. So he goes, he does not realize, he does not examine him, does not ask him questions, he's not proactive, and he remands him to police custody. Again, this man is found dead later on, and the police tries to cover up saying he tried to escape from the custody, this, that, how general statements are made in the courts about these things. So in this case, what happened was magistrate let him go without asking questions, and these police officials are later on acquitted. So you look at the role of the magistrate, a proactive magistrate. Remand is very important. It is at that time which determines everything as to what will happen to the personal liberty of an individual. Because it's a big thing, a man is in a normal setting. Think of it, if a man is in a normal setting, you're taking him out of his regular routine life and putting him somewhere. So it's a big thing. It's the personal liberty of a human being which is at stake. And on top of that, you have police officials who are trying to extract confessions, who are demanding bribes, who are doing these things. So who will put a check? The magistrate. So the role of the magistrate is very, very important in these cases. Now, some of the judgments on remand, which one should remember. Uh, uh, you can take down the citations if you want. One is CBI versus Ratin Dandapat. It's a 2015 Supreme Court judgment. Then the other is State through CBI versus Dawood Ibrahim. Now, in these cases, what the court has held that when can a police remand be granted? Can it be granted in case of a person who is arrested at the time of trial? Yes, the court said yes, it can be. Police remand can be sought of an accused arrested at stage of further investigation. There is no bar to it. The only thing to remember is a police remand cannot exceed for more than 15 days. Even during those first 15 days, if they want, they can give an interchangeable custody, police custody, judicial custody, police custody, judicial custody. If the court deems fit, they can do that also. It's not necessary it should be granted for all 15 days or at one go. It can be interchangeable too. And let's say a person has absconded, as I told you, CBI versus Ratin Dandapat and State through CBI versus Dawood Ibrahim. If a person is absconding, let's say 4-5 accused persons are absconding. Now, and they are arrested probably after filing of the charge sheet or probably during the middle of the trial. What will happen? Yes, they are still needed for proper investigation. Yes. Is there something more which needs to be extracted from them? Yes. Is there a recovery which has to be effected after their arrest? Yes. Then in those cases, if the court deems fits, they can grant remand to police custody. There is no bar in granting remand to police custody. The only thing to remember is it cannot be more than 15 days. And one more important thing is that even during, even after expiry of those 15 days, let's say it's a case of murder. And in that case of murder, it is also found that this person had stolen the property of the accused. And the accused had, sorry, the accused has stolen the property of the deceased. And this property is now recovered from some X place on its own, not at the instance of the accused. So now the police wants remand of this accused in police custody for further investigation. There is a specific bar. If something is done in the same transaction, if there is a lighter offense which comes into light or a more serious offense which comes into light in the same transaction, further police remand cannot be granted. The law has been made very clear on this point, and the judgment is CBI versus Anupam J. Kulkarni. Citation is 1992 SCR 3158. But if there is a different case and a different transaction, let's say a person has been sent to judicial custody, now it comes to light that he's accused of murder, let's say. He's been sent to judicial custody. Now it comes to light that he's also involved in some Hawala scam. Then police custody can be granted for another 15 days. It's a different transaction, different case, yes. But if it's the same transaction, in that case, no, it cannot be granted. That is what is the rule in case of remand. Now, two more important things which I think I should discuss with you. In these recent days, what is happening is now everything is being done through video conferencing. All the matters are being taken up through video conferencing. So very pertinent question arose before the courts as to whether remand can be sought through video conferencing. So if you look at section 167, clause 2, subclause B, it very categorically says, for the first time when a person is produced before the magistrate, he has to be produced in person. So it's a rule, it's a mandate, shall be produced physically, shall be produced in person. You cannot and should not and ought not produce that person via video conferencing for the first time. However, this rule has, in my opinion, it should not be done, but it has been diluted in Delhi also and in Karnataka also. However, Delhi says only in exceptional circumstances, and Karnataka also says in their rules that on video conferencing guideline rules, only in exceptional circumstances this should be done. For example, let's say somebody is suffering from coronavirus, but to my mind it comes, then why will the police go and arrest him and put him in custody in the first place? That is, he should be probably put under house arrest, or they should come up with something else. But they have given a few examples, like when somebody is in a containment zone, or somebody is suffering from coronavirus, then probably remand through video conferencing should be allowed even at the first instance. In my opinion, it should not be done. This should be discouraged completely, because there is a statutory mandate. Because if the statute says there's a principle of law and the principle of jurisprudence while interpreting law, if the act says that X thing should be done in X manner, then it has to be done in X manner. No rules, no guidelines can dilute that thing and ask them to do it in a Y manner. It's as simple as that. If it is told that you should do it like this, it has to be done like this. So therefore, if there is a specific mandate under the statute that the person has to be first produced in person, that person should be produced in person. Now we see a lot of we hear about this, transit remand. Now, what is this transit remand? Transit remand is granted when an accused, in simple words I'll tell you, when an accused has to be shifted from the place of arrest to the place of investigation. And the distance limit in our CRPC has been given as 30 kilometers. So if the person has to, let's say Chandigarh is the place where he's arrested, and Delhi is the place where he has to be investigated and the trial has to take place. So for covering that period of time, he has to be produced before the magistrate in Chandigarh court. He has to be produced there, not here. The remand has to be taken before that magistrate. That so-and-so person, so-and-so things. Again, it is the discretion of the judge whether or whether not to grant remand in these cases. That we want to produce him for so-and-so offense for so-and-so purpose in Delhi. So a transit remand may be granted. But however, even at that stage, an accused can apply for bail, for transit bail. He can show his credentials, show his credibility, show that he'll produce himself before the court, the other court in which the place, where the place of investigation is. Now, generally, the applications for remand, which are made, are called parcha remand in district courts. So just don't get surprised when you hear that word. Immediately it should strike to your mind that they are referring to remand. Now, coming to the concept of bail. Now, fairly we have understood what is arrest. We have fairly understood what is remand. Main thing, I think, main takeaway for you in these cases can be, what is the justification of exercise of power by the police? Look at section 41. If it is less than 7 years, then they have to see whether he is needed for proper investigation or not, whether there is any background, whether he can tamper, whether he has any previous history. All those elements have to be seen if it is less than 7 years. But if it is more than 7 years, then obviously he can be arrested. All these conditions are not required to be seen by the police, and the checks and balances by the magistrate after the 24-hour period begin. 1 or 2 points I think I missed out in arrest is preventive arrest. This is 1 or 2 things I just wanted to point out to you. Now, what happens in cases of preventive arrest? If you look at section 151 of CRPC, you will understand that when a police officer can also arrest when somebody has not actually committed an offense, but the police officer has information and knowledge, and he has some sort of belief, that this person is going to commit a cognizable offense. In those circumstances, a police person can arrest a person, but that arrest has to end when that apprehension that the commission of such cognizable offense would not be done by the accused, then that arrest has to end at that point of time, or otherwise you follow the general routine of 24 hours of production before the magistrate. In no case, a police person, no case, whatever case it may be, can keep the accused for more than 24 hours in custody. Now, arrest in cases of non-cognizable offenses. Now we all know what is the distinction between cognizable and non-cognizable offenses. So I'm not getting into that. In cases of non-cognizable offense, a police official cannot arrest without the permission of the magistrate. He needs an order of the magistrate to arrest. You have to basically rely on section 41 subclause 2, section 42 of CRPC and section 155 of CRPC. If you look at these three sections, you will understand how an arrest takes place in case of a non-cognizable offense. First, police official cannot arrest. Always remember, wants to arrest, he has to go to the magistrate to obtain an order. But what is an exception to this circumstance? There is an exception to this circumstance that he can still arrest a person of non-cognizable offense without an order of a magistrate. If you look at section 42, what is a non-cognizable offense? These are all small offenses. Does it mean they'll just get away by doing that? No, they cannot. Anybody who commits an offense cannot get away by doing that. So if you look at the scheme of section 42, it says that the police official will take down the name and residence and other identifiable details of the accused. He'll ask, what is your name? Where do you live? If he thinks you are telling him the truth, he has to let you go. He does not have the order, he cannot arrest you. But if in case he believes that whatever information you are furnishing is false and the names and the addresses you are trying to give are not true, then in that circumstance, he can arrest you. And till when will that arrest continue? 24 hours? No, not necessarily. The moment you give the true name and identifiable details, he can let you go. He has to let you go. There is no other reason for him to keep you there, and he cannot under law keep you there. But if in case, even within those 24 hours, he's not able to ascertain your true name, your true address, your identifiable details, in those circumstances, he will have to produce before the magistrate after 24 hours. That is what the scheme of section 42 is. So now we have seen basically almost all the sections on arrest. Medical examination we have dealt with. It's now some of the cases which I think you can look at while dealing with arrest. I'll just give you 2-3 cases. One is Joginder Kumar, which is the case of that young lawyer, 28-year lawyer who was taken from Ghaziabad to Mussoorie, as I told you. The citation I'll give you for this case, 1994, 4 SCC 260. Joginder Kumar is one case you should definitely read because that's how CRPC is translated and amended, in 2009. All this was not existing prior. So all we had were these judgments, 94 Joginder Kumar, 97 DK Basu. DK Basu, I've given you the citation. Another judgment you can probably read and might be helpful for you is Sheila Barse versus State of Maharashtra. I'll give you the citation for this judgment. I'll give you the citation a little later. This was on women prisoners, and when they were in police lockup, they suffered violence, custodial violence. And there was this activist who took up the case and she interviewed them in jail and then brought this whole matter before Supreme Court. Another case which might help you is Bhagalpur blinding case, which you must read. Khatri versus State of Bihar. There are series of orders passed in this case. It was a case where police officials had poured acid into the eyeballs of the accused persons and made them blind. So not only were they convicted later on, but they were also, the police officials were convicted, but the accused persons were granted compensation. So one more important element which I missed in DK Basu is that it also laid down the scheme of compensation in cases of custodial violence. I know the topic is not custodial violence, but it emanates from the arrest and the abuse of power by the police in cases of arrest. So you should know these cases. You should also look at compensation. For compensation, you should definitely read Neel Batti Behra versus State of Orissa. It's a 1993 Supreme Court judgment. You should read Kasturi Lal. It's a 1965 Supreme Court judgment. And then you should definitely see the amendments made in the Constitution, 357, 357A, 357B, 358 and 359 of CRPC as to how compensation has to be given, what is the role of the legal aid committee and all those things. They come into picture here. Now, one important amendment in my opinion, which have time and again been suggested by Law Commission also, that is incorporation of section 114B into Indian Evidence Act. Now what they proposed is that there should be a presumption of guilt in cases of custodial violence. However, it also suggested that though generally the presumption in criminal cases is you are innocent until proven guilty, but in cases of custodial violence, they specifically said, seeing what has been happening all these days, that there should be a presumption of guilt. However, the magistrate or the court which is deciding this case should be granted the power or should be vested with the discretion to decide whether or not such presumption will be invoked. So it's sort of a check and balance. It's on the magistrate to decide, though it can be exercised, sometimes in that favor or this favor, and there will be appeals, this, that. I'm not delving into that part of the issue. But what I'm trying to say is that reversal of burden, even if it is on the discretion of the magistrate, will or might, if not will, it might act as a deterrent in cases of custodial violence. Now, these are things. And one more quick thing which you should definitely see is the law on preventive detention. It's very important because we have seen 24 hours you have to be produced before magistrate. But there is an exception in cases of preventive detention, which you will find a mention of in the Constitution as well, Article 22(3). You can be detained for 3 months. 3 months is the minimum period of detention. And for exceeding that period, after 3 months, the accused person is put before an advisory board, which is headed by somebody who's qualified to become a high court judge. And the surprising part is that it depends on law to law. If you see Coffee Posa, Makoka, every law is different. So when you look at these laws, you will realize that there is no right to be represented by a lawyer before advisory board. This is very surprising because see, somebody who's arrested will not know how it works. He needs a lawyer to make him understand what the law is about, what are your grounds, what is this, what is that. But however, this is the law functions. You don't have a right to be represented by a lawyer. You have to represent yourself. However, the order passed by the advisory board is challengeable. That order has to be communicated and that order can be challenged subsequently. But 3 months is a huge period of time and then only you'll be placed before advisory board. However, there is one exception to this, that you cannot consult a lawyer. There is one exception to this. I think the case law is Kavita versus State of Maharashtra. If you look at that case law, I'll give you the citation. That case says that if in case during the proceedings before the advisory board, the other side takes assistance of a lawyer, then the accused becomes entitled to be represented or take assistance of a lawyer. It is only in that specific circumstance. Otherwise, in cases of preventive detention, the situation is very, very serious and the threshold is much higher. And even the requirement of advisory board can be dispensed by the law. It's in Article 22, subclause 7 of the Constitution, if you look, that you can be continued to be detained even after a period of 3 months without even being present before the advisory board. But that can be done only in exceptional circumstances, not in a regular circumstance. That has to be done in exceptional circumstances. Now, one more thing in arrest is a private person can also affect the arrest, but that private person has to, any private individual, not necessarily a police official, you and I can also affect an arrest, but that commission of offense has to take place before me. It should be a cognizable and non-bailable offense. Now, it is very unreasonable for somebody to expect an individual, especially in India, when we're not aware about our legal rights as to what is a cognizable offense or a non-bailable offense. But we can generally categorize and say serious offenses. Let's say somebody is committing murder before your eyes. Then you can arrest that person and immediately take that person to the police official who, if he finds that whatever you are telling is reasonable and credible, then he will re-arrest that person and the necessary will follow. 24 hours, then production before the magistrate, then remand, and then subsequently the filing of charge sheet and all that. And even a magistrate can also effect an arrest. For a magistrate to effect an arrest, one important thing one should remember is if the magistrate himself is effecting the arrest, he can never try that person. It is against the principles of natural justice. That person has to be forwarded to another magistrate and tried by another magistrate. Now, one more important thing, I think I missed out a lot on arrest, is that a person has to be produced before a magistrate within 24 hours. Now, what if a magistrate is not available? Let us assume a situation, the magistrate is not available. Before whom will the police official produce him? Then there is a provision in CRPC. It says that the person can also be produced before executive magistrate. However, the executive magistrate will have to forward that accused before the concerned magistrate first. Second, the executive magistrate cannot remand that person to police custody for more than 7 days. That's a bar. And who would that executive magistrate will be? On whom judicial powers have been conferred has to be the magistrate. It cannot be any executive magistrate. It has to be that executive magistrate who has been specifically granted judicial power just like a magistrate, and not more than 7 days. Two to three quick things you can remember is this. Now coming to, I'll quickly come to bail now. Now, if you look at bail, I think bail is the easiest and the most difficult thing. It's all about luck in the court, and it's all about how does it go, who's the judge. It's all about, there is no parameter to granting bail. That is what I'll say. It's the most blurred area of criminal justice, you know, where everything largely hinges upon the discretion of the judge. Probably you can say, see, there might be factors stated in section 437. It might be stated in so many judicial decisions, but it's largely the hunch of the bench. It is the most blurred area of criminal justice. It mainly is what is generally called judicial discretion. Bail is absolutely and absolutely judicial discretion. There is no statute, nothing. It is the judicial discretion of the court. But the question is how this judicial discretion should be exercised. How? Should it be on the whims and fancies of the judge granting the bail? Should it be guided by certain principles? And therefore, it is very important for us to read and see what is the jurisprudence of the bail, which has been developed over a period of time. Now, before I get into what is the jurisprudence of the bail, I'll quickly recapitulate a few sections of bail, though we all know all these sections. There are bailable offenses. We all know in bailable offenses, there is a right to get a bail. There is no discretion of the judge involved here. It's a bailable offense. I have to merely take the bail. It's my right. I'll get it. Now, bail is a matter of right in cases of bailable offenses. Now, what if there is a situation a person cannot furnish surety, cannot give bonds? I'll come to all that. What happens even if the person who has a right to bail cannot? Then over a period of time, there's a concept of personal bonds, which has been evolved by judiciary and which can be executed. Section 436 deals with bailable offenses. Section 437 deals with non-bailable offenses for granting of bail by any other court except High Court and Court of Sessions. And Section 439 is with respect to Court of Sessions and High Court's power to grant a bail. And Section 438 is on anticipatory bail. Anticipatory bail means bail granted in anticipation of arrest. You are yet not arrested, but you anticipate that you might be arrested, and therefore anticipatory bail may be granted to you. Now, this is largely the scheme of the Act. Now, before I proceed further, I'll just emphasize on Section 437, it does lay down certain parameters for granting of bails in non-bailable offenses. There should be some sort of, the first parameter is there should be a prima facie case. As we all have seen how when the police official is effecting arrest, there should be some credible information, reasonable suspicion, something, some complaint, you know, some material should be there. So that material forms the basis. Over a period of time when charge sheet is filed, things are different. Then the copy of the FIR, charge sheet, all has to be seen together. All those things seen together has to be seen by the judge at the time of granting bail, whether any prima facie case is made out, whether your name is in the FIR, whether any allegations are made against you in the FIR, whether there is anything against you in the charge sheet, whether any recovery has been effected against you, whether any recovery has been affected at your instance. All these things have to be seen at the time of granting bail. Then previous history of the accused matters. There's one thing which we tend to generally, miss while arguing bail matters is that previous history in cases of offenses where punishment is less than 7 years, then no bail shall be granted, provided I am convicted of such an offense for 2 times at least. And for offenses for more than 7 years or life or death, 1 conviction is more than enough. So that might, be a hindrance in granting bail. Then in cases of women or sick people or infirm people, then there are special circumstances under which bail can be granted. And it is mandatory to hear the public prosecutor for offenses more than 7 years, life and death, if they are punished by that. And we see a lot of successive bail applications being filed in the court. That can only be filed if there is a change of circumstance. It's very important to remember, today a charge sheet is filed, you apply for bail, then there has to be some change of circumstance for you to apply for a second bail. The only remedy otherwise is that you appeal in the higher court. Otherwise, you have to wait for a change of circumstance or filing a successive bail application. Now, the courts can obviously impose certain conditions while granting bail, and there are so many conditions that are being imposed. I'll come to that. This is generally the scheme of the act. Now, there are few decisions which one must see while dealing with the jurisprudence of bail. One is 1970 judgment, 1978 judgment by Justice Krishna Iyer. It's one of the most leading judgments on bail, we can say, which emphasizes what bail is. It actually lays down what bail is. What is the idea of the bail? Is bail a mode of punishment? No. Bail should never, the court should never decide, I will not grant bail to this accused just because he has committed such a grave and serious offense. No, it is not to punish a person who is being tried for an offense. It is not. It is not a mode of punishment. What you have to see is prima facie. You have to see the case first. Second, whether you will be able to secure his attendance, whether he will threaten any witnesses, whether he will flee from the process of justice, whether anything further is required from him or not. All these factors have to be seen at the time of granting bail. It should not be a case, where the court decides or, prejudges the accused. That should not be the concept. Prejudging of the accused should and is not the concept of the bail. Now, one quick judgment one should remember is Gurucharan versus State of Delhi, which says that a new circumstance should come before the court when you have to cancel somebody's bail. So a bail has been granted, then a new circumstance has to come before the court for cancelling the bail of that person. One quick judgment which you should see is Dataram versus State of UP, which is Justice Lokur's judgment. It's a recent judgment. It's a case of cheating actually. And in that case, I'll just quickly share this and then I'll wrap it up. It's a very interesting case because nowadays a lot of cheating cases are coming to the courts, 37 lakhs, 40 lakhs, 1 crore, 5 crores, 10 crores. In this case, what happened was that this person who was accused of an offense of cheating, he was never arrested during the entire period of investigation. Neither was he arrested after the filing of the charge sheet. He was not arrested at all. So what he did was he approached the court, the High Court, and he said that grant me bail, anticipatory bail. In UP, you generally have the concept of arrest on stay. There is no anticipatory bail, though there was something in the news regarding introduction of the provisions for anticipatory bail. And when he approached the court, what it did was it directed the accused to go to the trial court and surrender before the trial court rather than asking for bail before this court. So when he went to the trial court sent him to judicial custody. So in this case came to Supreme Court before Justice Lokur, and he said that this is not a matter where bail should have, that person should have been sent to judicial custody, and subsequent to that he applied for bail. It is not a case where bail should have been refused. Why? Because the man is always present. He might have taken 37 lakhs, he might have taken 40 lakhs, but he was actively pursuing all this time. He was going from one court to another to apply for bails. He was present before the police officers during the entire investigation. His attendance was secured before the trial court. So all these factors should be seen, and bail should not be denied as a mode of punishment. So you should see this latest judgment by Justice Lokur. Now, and anticipatory bail, we all know Guru Baksh Singh Sibaiya and Siddharam Maitre. One quick brief I'll tell you is Sushila Agarwal versus State of Delhi. It's the constitutional bench judgment. It has categorically laid down now that the period of anticipatory bail does not end when the trial begins. It continues till the end of the trial. However, the courts can grant special features, can add special features or characteristics to the bail if they deem fit. They can say probably you have to apply for bail in trial court for so and so reason, or the trial court can exercise its mind, or whatever. They can add special features, but unless some special feature is added in a normal course, it will be till the end of the trial. And you can also see Prithvi Raj Chauhan case for SC/ST Act, where the court said that anticipatory bail in cases for SC/STs can only be granted in those cases when no prima facie case is made out. These are quick judgments on anticipatory bail. Then we all know about default bail. Default bail is important. Why? Because just take a quick note of this judgment. S. Kasi versus State. It was delivered by Justice Bhushan on 19th of June. So what happened was that there was this judgment by Madras High Court saying that the police officials, there's a provision in CRPC 167 that if charge sheet is not filed within 60 days or within 90 days for respective offenses, then default bail will come into play. Now this was interpreted to mean that no default bail will be granted to the accused by Madras High Court. This judgment subsequently traveled to Supreme Court, and Supreme Court said that Article 21 cannot be suspended. It's not a case of emergency, and even in cases of emergency, Article 21 does not stand suspended. Neither does our limitation order of 20th March means that police is merrily going around not submitting charge sheets and the accused are languishing in the jail. 167 to CRPC is independent, and our limitation extension order does not apply to that. Now coming to bail bonds quickly, if you look at the provisions of bail bonds, it's incorporated in CRPC from 444 onwards. If you look at after the provisions of the bail, it's incorporated. Now if you look at the bail bonds, then how the jurisprudence has developed is that I'll just give you briefly in 2 lines that if a person has been granted bail, and just because he cannot furnish a bail bond does not mean that he will languish in the jail. Just because a person is poor does not mean he will languish in the jail. The only thing is you can also be released on bail on execution of personal bond, provided attendance of that person can be secured. Even a poor man, a beggar, can also be your surety. It is not necessary that surety means some sound financial surety. Till that person can assure your presence in the court, it is such a surety is valid, and the only condition for a surety is that surety should be of fit state of mind, and his address should be identifiable. This is the only condition. And one of the judgments on surety which I would suggest you to read is this is again Justice Krishna Iyer's judgment, and where he has said that how people are languishing in the jail. And in fact, Justice Geeta Mittal had also taken note of it in one of the judgments and said that and had passed detailed orders in Delhi High Court about how so many under trials who have been granted bail are languishing, and they should be allowed to be released on bail on execution of personal bond. I think it's time. So if there are any questions, then we can take those questions.
Ritika, I request you to take up the questions as those are there in the chat box.
Yes, yes, sir. So, ma'am, there is a question from one of our participants, and he asked, police have the right to arrest or no arrest? Only one thing is there, that they have to give the reason in writing after the 2009 amendment. This is good that they have to give the reason in writing, but arrest or no arrest would depend on the judgment of the police officer himself. How should we substantiate his judgment or his decision?
How should we
substantiate his judgment or his decision? The judgment of the police official. How can we substantiate that?
Thank you for the question. See, it's not in every case that the police official has to give reasons. If you look at the scheme of CRPC, section 41 says only in those cases where the offense is punishable where the imprisonment is less than 7 years, only in those cases they have to record reasons in writing. So that is the only provision which is available to us. They have to record reasons in writing. That's it. If you are looking at whether how to ascertain or not to ascertain, it is where the magistrate steps into. At the time of granting of remand, the magistrate can look into the FIR, the magistrate can look into the case diary, the magistrate can look into all these details, whether or not such arrest is justified or not. So 24 hours, after 24 hours, it's the checkpoint is the magistrate. He has to decide at the time of granting remand. He can discharge. As I told you, the magistrate also has the power, provided he has the power to try that case. Otherwise, he'll have to send to the concerned magistrate who has the power to try.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Another question we have from his sir itself, and he asks, what if police arrest and not produced with the magistrate? How many days maximum police can take remand at once?
See, if you look at the remand provision, maximum period is 15 days. There cannot be any remand beyond period of 15 days, but there should, by way of judicial development and by way of caution and also rules in respective high courts, if you look at, it says that remand should not be granted for the entire period of 15 days at one go. It should be either for 2 days, 3 days. That is how remand should be done, not for entire 15 days.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you.
Another question is from Mr. Anish, and he asks, under section 57 CRPC, person arrested without warrant has to be produced before magistrate within 24 hours. If someone is produced under section 80 of the CRPC after arrest in furtherance of a warrant issued, would the arrest be automatically remanded to judicial custody, or does police have the right to request for police custody under section 167?
See, now if you look at the remand provisions, this is a question of transit remand. What happens in cases of transit remand is that you have to obtain transit remand. At the time of obtaining of transit remand, the lawyer or the accused himself can also move an application. You can apply for bail. There is a provision for transit bail. It's very clear. You can apply for bail, and after within those 24 hours, when you're brought to a different jurisdiction, then you are presented before that court. Even before that court, you can apply for bail. They have to follow 24-hour rule every time. That's the mandate of the Constitution. That is the mandate of the statute. That cannot be violated under any circumstances.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Another question, which is from my side only, and it is, during the lockdown period, the police officials have been recognized as Corona warriors. But on the other hand, there were also no dearth of incidents of police atrocities where they have abused and exceeded their power to make people comply with the law. Why was there no accountability for their acts? And what are your views on such use of excessive powers by the police?
That's a very good question and a very relevant question. See, the thing is that one size does not fit all. We all know that. Be it doctors, be it police officials, or be it any profession, one size does not fit all. Though it may so happen that 80% or 60% or a large chunk of them are just the same. I am nobody to say that. But one size does not fit all. Definitely some of the police officials we have been seeing in news, we have been experiences when we go out on roads, they are doing a good job, hands down to them. But that does not give them the power to abuse whatever power has been granted to them. Now, if you look at one of the options which I think can be, one of the answers I can give is, there is a prevention of torture bill which is pending. And it's been long debated and it has still not been enacted. And neither there is any accountability for the police officials when custodial violence happens, except that, you know, sometimes magisterial inquiry can take place. They can be prosecuted like a regular individual, how a regular criminal is prosecuted. But this is not what we need. In these pressing times, probably it's time now that the legislation enacts and the parliament enacts this legislation on prevention of torture, which has been long due pending. And I think Ashwini Kumar had filed a writ in the Supreme Court saying that this should be enacted. However, a statement was made by the Attorney General saying that it will be looked into, and that's how the writ petition was disposed of. But I think this should be re-debated, and Prevention of Torture Act should be in custody should be enacted.
And the last question, ma'am, as you give your personal view that arrested person should firstly be produced in person and not through video conferencing, even after the exceptions and rules amended by different high courts, what made you think that personal appearance is that necessity and which cannot be fulfilled by video conferencing?
See, I'll tell you what, you can never identify somebody. Maybe, you know, I'm sitting here, but the police official is sitting right in front of me and trying to, you know, or maybe my mother is sitting next to him and he's holding something, or maybe not physically he's threatening me. Maybe, you know, he's saying, I'll hush up the case probably if you give me so much amount. So an individual is under constant pressure from the police. And only and if only when he sees the magistrate in person. See, we as lawyers see magistrates every day. This is not how a layman or an individual is not visited court once on being arrested, interacts with an unknown person who's a judge, he's under fear. Maybe the police official tells him something. Who's going to take care of all those things? We don't even know whether the person who's being sent to the remand is that very person. It's blurred. Do you think all the district courts in this country will have that efficiency of video quality? First question is no. Not all the district courts can have that efficiency, and who will actually verify it is the same individual? Police officials himself. Then what is the point of having a remand in the first place? First presence has to be physical to ensure that the person is safe. This is the mandate of the statute, and I think it is somewhere implicit under Article 21 of our Constitution, because it is at that point where the magistrate can check himself that I stand as an accused. I stand debarred of my personal liberty. It's a very crucial point. First production should be at least, and the statute says the subsequent productions can be by video conferencing. There is no harm. First point is very important. Then once he becomes familiar, he's seen the judge has seen him, things may be a little different, then it can be done in through video conferencing, though it should not be, in my opinion. Remand should never be done in video conferencing. I give you so many examples. He went to the veranda and checked that person. So it's important, it is at that stage, just because the magistrate was vigilant. Otherwise, that matter would have, Justice Chandrachud would not have written such a beautiful judgment if that magistrate was not so proactive. So that is the importance of a magistrate and physical production.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for addressing all the questions very patiently.
Thank you so much, Ritika. Thank you so much, Nitish.
Well, it gives me immense pleasure, ma'am, to take a moment thanking you for being here with us today on our board. It was indeed an informative session, ma'am, and was a topic of practical importance. One should know as a lawyer and a citizen of this country on law of arrest, remand, and bail. As we all know how important it is for us to know the latest judicial developments on the subject in which you have thrown light upon. Thank you, ma'am, for enlightening us today in this topic. It was an honor to have you on our board, ma'am. Lastly, I would like to thank our viewers who took out time to stay with us till the end. Last but not the least, I would like to thank Nitesh sir for giving me the opportunity to be the moderator for today's webinar. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Ritika, for giving such a good and wonderful note for our speaker. And it's always our pleasure to have you also on our board as a moderator. So once again, from the bottom of my heart, I thanks Tanya Agarwal for taking out time from her busy schedule, being the criminal lawyer, filing bail virtually every day and opposing the remands. So we are once again thankful to you, and we look forward for have some more informative webinars on the criminal law from you. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, Ritika.
Thank you so much, Nitish. Thank you so much.